All right. Well, so John, since you're joining us for the first time, do you want to say a bit about uh, who you are, where you're coming from, and where your interest in Steiner or this particular book is stemming from?
Sure. Uh, I'm from Manhattan. I live in the Lower East Side, the East Village. I've lived here over 40 years. So I've walked on the wild side. The first time I came to New York, the mid 70s, it was pretty incredible. Um, and then I think of myself as an activist more than an intellectual. So I was very much an actor, writer, artist type. Now I'm an aging bohemian. But back then, I got very involved in the gay movement, and right at the when the AIDS epidemic hit, there was an explosion of interest in the occult.
Hmm.
And Steiner was everywhere. Actually, lots of people were reading Steiner. So I and I studied body work and therapy and all kinds of things, but I went to Steiner quite a bit just to give me some comfort because I felt in him he was in a similar kind of dynamic because he was very aware of the paranormal and the anomalous. And he also was in a environment that did not support or encourage or sponsor that. So he had to create conditions for himself so that he could communicate adequately what was probably not in a lot of people's experience. Or if they had it in their experience, they had to stifle it or suppress it. So I admire him enormously and read a lot of his stuff, which was way over my head. But I was having enough of those weird experiences myself to recognize that the cognitive dissonance I felt was okay, that it was a normal kind of reaction to being in very dramatic and stressful um, public events that were happening. Anyway, that's my brief sort of gut reaction to reading Steiner again and going back into these texts as I'm not a philosopher. I come from an esotericist orientation. And I think that's how I'm reading Steiner. And actually, I think that's accurate. It would be accurate to say that he was less of a philosopher than he was an esotericist.
Hmm.
Um, um, anyway, that's my spiel. I hope that is useful to you guys. And I'm really excited that you've made this event happen. And I'm very encouraged by watching the two previous videos. Thanks.
Oh, great. That was my next question to see if you had a chance to watch our first session together. Ashton and I had a session initially on chapter one, and then we did chapter two last time. Chapter three is very short, so we'll have lots of time for discussion. Ashton and I forgot last time to say that we wanted to invite volunteers each week to kind of just lead us in to the chapter with a brief, summary statement and maybe a word about what you found most interesting. We didn't do it. We didn't ask that last time, so no worries if nobody feels up to it. But I just wanted to throw it out there if anyone wants to lead us in.
I would volunteer for the next time if you want to volunteer, because I've looked a little bit at that chapter. It looks very daunting, so it'd be an interesting challenge for me to try to summarize something.
Okay, I appreciate that, John. You can do chapter four next time, which is also pretty short relative to chapter two, at least.
I actually have a couple quotations that I thought might be worthwhile to begin with, unless anybody else has something they'd like to begin with. Okay. So I was actually going to share this last time, but there was just great conversation happening, so I didn't get to it. But in the first chapter, towards the end, so this is page 72 of the PDF, Steiner says, "For the unbiased observer, Greek thought life has an element that makes it appear perfect in the best sense of the word. It is as if the energy of thought in the Greek thinkers had worked out everything that it contains in itself. Whoever judges differently will notice on closer inspection that somewhere in his judgment an error is involved. Later world conceptions have produced accomplishments through other forces of the soul. I think that's really interesting, that last sentence. Later world conceptions have produced accomplishments through other forces of the soul. And to just pay attention to that throughout the text, and then connecting that with this passage on page 79 in chapter 3. In the world conceptions of the Gnostics, Dionysus and Scotus Eriugena, the human soul feels its roots in a world ground on which it does not base its support through the forces of thought, but from which it wants to receive the world of thought as a gift. The soul does not feel secure in the native strength of thought. It strives, however, to experience its relation to the world ground in the form of thought. The soul has thought itself enlivened by another energy that derives from religious impulses, whereas in the Greek thinkers, it lived out of its own strength. Thought in this age existed, so to speak, in a form in which its own energy was dormant. In the same way, we may also think of the energy of picture conception in the centuries that preceded the birth of thought. There must have been an ancient time when consciousness in the form of picture conception flourished, the same as did the later thought consciousness in Greece. It then drew its energy out of other impulses, and only when it had gone through this intermediate stage did it transform into thought experience. It is an intermediate state in the process of thought development that we witness in the first centuries of the Christian era. So I think, again, here, with that sort of description of this this time when picture consciousness was really strong and then sort of exhausts itself, and then the kind of thought itself has its moment and then exhausts itself. There's a kind of life cycle that is being conveyed. But yeah, I just thought those would be worthwhile to begin with. And maybe somebody has some thoughts related to that or related to something different.
Related to that, Ashton, but also this for me is a pretty much a general impression of the chapter or where it fits in the overall book so far. And I guess it's pretty basic, but I just feel like saying this, that as thankfully it is a very short chapter, so I got to really grapple with it. But it's again, and within the whole thesis of the book, I guess this comment is pretty obvious, but what's coming to me, as we're going through these chapters and these phases of evolution, is that it's kind of this grand picture of like this historical Goethean metamorphosis of human consciousness, right? I mean, there's lots of details. This philosopher was thinking this, and this one was doing that, and there's all the details to study. But yeah, that's my standing back and looking at the big picture impression is this Goethean kind of metamorphosis.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's, I don't think you need to have a background in the history of philosophy for this text to be rewarding, because Steiner's really just using that history to provide some examples of a metamorphosis or evolution of consciousness. And that process can be understood on its own. But if you have studied the history of philosophy, I mean, I can't help but detect a sort of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit in the background here, informing Steiner's treatment. And Hegel very explicitly was drawing on Goethe's understanding of plant metamorphosis in that book to describe how what may seem like a new movement of thought that is negating its predecessor is in fact would not in fact have even been possible without the predecessor. And so in the same way that when a fruit emerges to negate the blossom, it's not like the fruit could have arisen without the blossom first. But it's interesting in this early Christian period, this shift from the confidence that the Greeks had in thinking itself, as though thought was self-grounding, and the transition. I think Steiner zeroes in on Plotinus as this transition where Plotinus really respected the intellect, the nous, but also through attaining a state of mystical contemplation of the one, realized there was something beyond thought and the concept's ability to understand, right? And so for Plotinus, mysticism ends up supplanting philosophy as the sort of highest mode of insight into the nature of reality. And he wasn't a Christian, though. That does sort of exemplify what these early Christian thinkers were attempting to do, using Greek thought to justify a kind of revelation. And so, as Ashton was saying and sharing in that quote, a new soul capacity is kind of coming online, and maybe isn't perfect at thinking in the way that the Greeks were, but it's starting to develop this other insight. Steiner uses this term projection. He says right at the end of the chapter that the early Christians sought to project the energy of thought onto an extra-human world power, which I found an interesting choice of words. But yeah.
Matt, just a quick question. You, in your comparison, or just in noting Hegel in the background, would you say that this statement where Steiner says that whoever judges differently will notice on closer inspection, well, just that thought exhausted itself with the Greeks, and that later world conceptions have produced accomplishments through other forces of the soul? Would you say that distinguishes it a bit from Hegel, or would that be sort of consistent with the phenomenology of spirit? If spirit is sort of I guess I don't know it as well as you do, but I guess I tend to think about spirit in terms of thinking.
I think that's consistent with Hegel's view of the Greeks. Yeah.
But of the later world conceptions that aren't arising out of thought working itself out.
Oh, well, no, that's probably more original to Steiner, in the sense that Hegel really emphasized thought and the work of the concept. And for Steiner, more important than that is sort of, I mean, particularly in our time, individual freedom and creativity and moral action and so forth, rather than just arriving at some completed system. But yeah, I don't want to overemphasize the similarity to Hegel. I think there are important differences, but just in Steiner's treatment of history, I think it's a Hegelian method to look at the history of philosophy in this way, right? Hegel's was a Goethean method, so it's Goethean and Hegelian, I guess, but yeah.
I think there's a little Strindbergian. I hear echoes of Strindberg in here, especially when he talks about overbeing and the hidden Godhead. And the primordial being is united with primordial goodness and primordial beauty. And the soul witnessing a descending order of beings that lead down to man in a hierarchical way. This kind of hierarchy, ascending and descending currents. But I think what's interesting about Steiner, and you guys can correct me, but I think I think Steiner, unlike maybe Plotinus, I may be wrong about Plotinus, but I think he sees it as a two-way street. It's going in both directions. Love is a two-way street. And that the Godhead must have some vested interest in the outcome here to go to all this trouble. And so I think that makes a much more sense to me than that kind of Plotinian, beam me up out of here kind of Gnostic orientation. Perhaps I know he wasn't a Gnostic, but I think there's something very Christ-like. Christ is aeon, I think he says, that I think strikes a very deep chord with me, because I think Steiner, among the integralists, he's a hardcore Christian,
Yeah.
or Christic, I suppose. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Lorenz. I saw you gesturing there.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out a connection between some concepts that we came about. We were hierarchy and Christianity and Hegel, and the difference between the use that this early Christian or later Greek philosopher did of the same concepts that the early Greek philosophers did. That is the concept of Trinity. I think that the concept of Trinity comes in this period. It comes both through the Christian reflection of the fathers of the church about the nature of God and it's being three and one at the same, and also you find it in Plotinus, because the hierarchies of the emanations are always groups of three. You have a dyad, and then you have a synthesis, which is the same as Hegel. And this you get also in Dionysus, the pseudo-Dionysus hierarchies of heaven, which is the basis then for Steiner structure of the heavens. So this concept of Trinity, I think, is, even if Steiner doesn't underline it in this chapter, but I think it's at the core of this change of path between the Greek thought period and then the religious period we're coming in. Because when you get the idea of something which is one and three at the same time, you go beyond logic, at least the usual Aristotelian logic, and you start dealing with paraconsistent logics. And this can be maybe rationalized today, but of course at the time it surely was a turn toward the mystical side, because you're going against logic, so you turn from philosophy to religion. And I think there is a reflection of this later on in Hegel and in Steiner and in Goethe, who are all using the same concept. But this very chapter, I think, is secretly about the coming into play of the concept of Trinity. Because if you think of the Neoplatonists, even Iamblichus, for example, you get the same structures of Pythagoras. I mean, he even wrote, the life of Pythagoras, and all the Neoplatonists were actually Neo-Pythagoreans. And but there's a strong difference between the system of the Pythagoreans, which doesn't really give too much importance on three. You have the Tetractys, but the Tetractys is not the tree of life. And what transforms the Pythagorean Tetractys into the structure of the tree of life is exactly what we could call Hegelian dialectics, the workings of the three. And you have not just the 10 spheres, but the 10 spheres working into groups of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And I think this relates to infinity, to the threshold of logics, and to the very concept of God. You pass from philosophy to theology.
Yeah, that's an important insight, Lorenzo. The emergence of the Trinity, which, say, to Aristotle, was just totally irrational logically, but with this mystical insight or revelation into the nature of the divine, it's as though the soul intuited something and logic needed to catch up to it. Yeah. Though you get hints of it in, I think, already in Plato and
the crisis was open because the Pythagoreans already met with the discovery of irrational numbers, this problem, but it kind of was lurking beneath, kind of, or not accepted, not really into the discourse, but as a kind of taboo. While with the new Platonists, it becomes the center of the thing, dialectics, beyond logics.
Right. Yeah. It brings an element. I mean, it reminds me of what Steiner discusses in another text in his interdisciplinary astronomy lectures. I don't know if any of you have seen that, but he talks about the ratios between the orbits of the planets producing irrational numbers, and so that we can't finally calculate these orbits. And Kepler ran up against this, and but for Steiner, this is an indication that it's not simply a rational system. It's a living organism of some kind, right? So it's constantly exceeding itself. No two orbits are ever the same, right? So it's a growing, living being.
Yeah, Steiner didn't have the concept, but today we might express it in terms of chaos theory. Today we have the concept of chaos and emergency, which, by the way, emerges from the problem of the three bodies. Right. It's chaos theory develops out of that, but of course Steiner didn't have the concept yet.
Right.
I have a quick question for John. You referred to a certain thinker whose name starts with S. I didn't catch the name you said.
Oh, I was talking about Swedenborg.
Oh,
He
okay,
was
okay, I got you now.
The Swedish mystic, scientist, scholar, who I'm sure, I'm sure that Steiner knew who he was. Surely he read him, because Swedenborg was very famous during his time and quite notorious. He created a lot of scandals, but there was something about the out-of-body experiences, the lucid dreams, the way we would describe it and the way they would describe it may be slightly different, but I think most of us can recognize that both Swedenborg and Steiner were working with subtle realms, and especially in the more esoteric work that he does later. I know this is an early work of his where he's working on philosophy, but later on, I think he, like in Death and Sleep, is a chapter, I think, in one of his occult books, I can't remember, but it's basically, you can tell he's doing dream yoga. Later on, he would give he would sort of go into a light trance. He would keep his eyes open, but he was just sort of in a dark room, and he would read people. He would give people personal readings about their soul's evolution. So he was quite a psychic. He was a very psychic fellow. He was definitely doing paraconsistent logics here. And I think that's, I think it was very poignant that he said towards the end of his life, he died 64, I think, was fairly young, right when he was getting ready to peak, go to another phase. He said very poignantly that he got burned out by giving so many readings to so many people. And he evidently sort of said that he hadn't grounded himself properly because there was much more energy coming through him than he could ground. So I think that's very, very much about, and also he was an artist. He was a man of the theater, who wrote plays. He was into movement. And I think, Matt, you have that beautiful background, that blackboard drawing that he did. If you've looked at those background drawings that he did during his lectures, the colors are so bold and they're so gestural. And I actually did eurythmy at the Steiner's there's a Steiner community nearby, and I did eurythmics. So I think a lot of his motivation, he wanted to catch a rhythm. He wanted to share rhythms with people. So he was very much a man of the theater and an artist. And I think among the integral thinkers, he's by far the most aesthetically oriented. That's my read on him. So thanks for all of these great ideas. Oh, yes.
Is that the eurythmy
Oh, yes,
alphabet?
that's fabulous. Yeah, that's the I didn't get into a robe and do all that stuff, but I was introduced to some of the basics. And I could tell he was operating with synesthesias, but operating, overlapping sensory systems. And he was into group dynamics. So it's very hard to write about that kind of thing. You sort of have to be there. And he was also a great architect. I mean, the guy was like, I think he was like an ET or something. Anyway, thanks.
It reminds me of what Steiner talks about, these different ages. We're dealing in the age of the intellectual soul now, but the age of the consciousness soul in our time. Maybe Ashton or one of you can remind me that it's Steiner intends it to be, and this is very evident in his work, or describes it as an age wherein we really need to not rely so heavily on thought or on religion in its traditional sense, but on the arts. It's this age where we need to learn to express ourselves artistically in order to escape what would otherwise be a very lonely, kind of isolated type of existence. Hence Steiner's emphasis on these various new art forms. And we'll get, I guess, later in our time reading this book together, we'll arrive at the present age too. So,
John, do you think that Swedenborg influenced Madame Blavatsky too before Steiner?
I would be surprised if she didn't know Swedenborg. Like I said, like Henry James and William James and Charles Saunders Peirce, all those American pragmatists, they knew who Swedenborg was. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't like in our age, he's sort of like an obscure figure perhaps. But I would guess, I'm not a Blavatsky scholar, but I would be very surprised if she did know Swedenborg. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Do you know about that, Matt or Ashton?
I'm not sure.
Do any of you actually read some of Swedenborg's work?
I have, actually.
Very little.
Oh, right. Apocalypse Revealed.
Huh.
It's fabulous.
I've read Kant's critique of Swedenborg. Kant really was interested in the occult, actually, but when he read Swedenborg, he found himself compelled to write this critical reply that's called, I think, Dreams of a Spirit Seer.
A visionary.
Yeah.
In Italian, it's called, Sogni di un visionario.
Yeah. Where, he finds all sorts of logical flaws in Swedenborg's account of the angelic realms and so on. But kind of, I think Kant was a little just bitter that he didn't find this sort of proof of a noumenal realm that he wanted, but he was very interested nonetheless. What are you thinking, Chad?
A lot. Actually, I kind of messed up and I read chapter up to like chapter 6 or something. I thought for some reason you guys would be reading more than just this one chapter. So I went deep and I kind of, this chapter isn't like strongly in my mind. So yeah, sorry. I'm a little bit ahead.
That's fine.
No apologies. It's very short.
Yeah. I guess I was picking up on, I was curious about you brought in the very last sentence, last paragraph. This world conception allows the Greek thought experience to continue its effect, but does it in such a way that it is now anchored in the uniform divine world ground. It leaves us with the impression of being a manifestation of the fact that the developing human soul did not feel in itself the intrinsic energy of thought. It therefore projected this energy into an extra human world power. It's an interesting choice of words as far as projection is what struck me funny, in the sense of I don't know, like
yeah, I think one should be careful to the fact he is talking about the human soul. I mean, being it's Steiner, we shouldn't take it as meaning human, thought or human. It could be technical, like that part of human being, which is soul, which is just a part which is related to images and to emotions. It's now I'm not enough expert to talk about technical anthroposophical stuff, but maybe that's a key to this sentence.
Yeah, I think I was thinking in the sense of psychological projection, rather than, I think what you're saying is that, or what Steiner, I think, is suggesting by the whole book is that it's the same function ultimately of the soul that's either in a picture oriented, like early Greek philosophers, and then it moves into thought and then back into a spiritual kind of conception or perception. That's the thing. Is it conception? I guess that's where we get to projection.
Right.
Um,
This reminds me of what Jeff was saying about the Goethean metamorphosis here. There's in the picture consciousness period, it's as though thought comes to the mind from the outside. And then as Greek thought life develops, that vector reverses, right? It comes from within and moves out. But now in this early Christian era, there's a shift once again in the reverse of that movement, where it's almost like there's an incubation that needs to take place. It's like thought did as much as it could to develop the inner life, but then there's this need to, when it reached completion and exhausts itself, we have to turn back out almost to the periphery again, and return to the soul life and the emotional and the religious impulses and so on, and let thought rest, as it were, in this sense that there is a God out there that will, in a way, provide the ground for our own existence, the world's existence, and that our thought kind of pales in comparison to that, right? But that's not the end of the story, obviously.
right. I think when I'm conceptualizing the picture consciousness, I think I'm conceptualizing it as not something that's like coming from without per se, as much as it is that the mind is not separate from the outer world. It's embedded in it. And it's like gnosis. It's a co-creative knowing that's happening in an immediate sense, not, like it's not
There
coming
could
from
be
the out.
there could be some intermediate level. I don't know if anybody is familiar with Julian Jaynes' theory of the dual consciousness and the spring of what's it called, the
Bicameral mind.
bicameral mind. Thank you. The bicameral mind. In the bicameral mind, you get that your own thoughts come to you as spoken by an entity, as if we're intimately connected to the gods or to some supernatural being who is talking to you, but you don't recognize the rational thought as your own, but you project it to a supernatural being, even if this is already a more developed stage than the, let's say, more animal, complete compenetration of thought and experience that I think you were talking about, because now you already have a voice that is speaking to you.
Mhm.
Can I interject?
Please.
Chad, go ahead.
No, go ahead, John.
Oh, what I was thinking, this goes back to something Ashton remarked on, I think, in some of the introductory, and something that you were saying, Chad. I mean, you quoted Barfield, and I thought Barfield, you said, was probably was inspired quite a bit by Steiner. I remember a remark that Barfield has about these primordial peoples. they were embedded in nature. So the boundaries were much more fluid. And so rather than standing on a platform and there was something out there, as in the modern mind, they were much more, it was much more, nature was like a garment that people would wear. So they were deeply immersed in it. So it seems to me there was much more of an interoceptive, proprioceptive, kinesthetic, non-touch kinesthetic, much more of, I guess, what we modernists would call like a synesthetic, or is it a
That's
synesthesia?
why they were giants.
Right, right. So there's much more of a synesthesia going on in these earlier peoples than, which of course is, I think we're all have synesthesia when we're children. We're sort of educated out of it and learn how to do that Western mind kind of thing where you're standing, Earth is a platform that you stand upon and there it all is out there, and you sort of can diagram it or make pictures of it on occasion. So, that's what's coming to me now. And I know Ashton did the three circles stacked on top of each other, and I think there were waves. And I remember the middle one was sort of like an integrative, sort of interface space between the one on the top and the one on the bottom. So I'm just curious about that. I hope that is of some use to us, because I think that Steiner was bringing back into his discourse and into his spiritual trainings with people these capacities, these latent capacities for synesthesia, to re-embody after the visual, after the perceptual conceptual split, which I think you mentioned, Matt, that concept percept split, which we're also used to, but I think there are many of us for whom the world has never been disenchanted. There never has been that split, but you have to sort of keep that a secret. You can get in trouble. And that's why I think Steiner is so interesting to study right now, because I think this perceptual conceptual split is very dramatically being demonstrated in our public discourse right now. And I also see many efforts to find out what's in between. So anyway, that's my sharing. I'm sort of working on this. Thank you for this opportunity.
Was your hand going up a second ago, Jeff, or no? Yeah, that line from Barfield that these primordial peoples wore the world like a garment, I think is a helpful image. I went back to chapter 2, it's page 54 in the PDF, where Steiner says that before thought formed a wall around the human soul, that the soul had formerly been as if it were within the phenomena of nature. What it experienced in these natural phenomena, like the activities of its own body, presents itself to the soul in the form of images that appeared in vivid reality. And then thought, by the power of thought, this whole panorama was extinguished. So it's as if like the thunderstorms, like the changes in the weather, it's as if this primal mode of consciousness experienced that as its own, as though internal to its own body, right? As though there were no separation, and what happens to me and what I do through the effort of my own will is kind of there's a blurry boundary between the two, and the will and through thought gradually becomes more differentiated.
The thought and language.
And language, right? Yeah.
You know, Vico's idea of the cycles,
right,
of civilizations, and the beginning with the giants.
Mm-hmm.
Giants that were giants because of what you were talking just a minute ago, the fact that the whole world around you was perceived as your own body. So your own bodies was the whole of nature, which now is the kind of consciousness that we have in dream.
Mm-hmm.
Because in dreams, our body becomes the world inside which we move and we have our dream adventures.
Right.
And so we are kind of progressively incorporating outer layers, but still keeping the older layers inside us as subsidiary states of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Say so. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I often feel like when we're sort of among strangers and making awkward conversation, we always talk about the weather, and I feel like it's kind of an archaic vestige of this earlier mode of embeddedness. It's like, well, what do we share? Well, we share our embeddedness in the body of the world, so let's talk about that. So it's still very much these earlier phases of consciousness evolution are still very much with us. We're focusing on some other elements.
And Matt, to go back to the quote you brought up on thought building a wall around the soul, that reminds me of something important. There's a whole parallel to all of this in Wilhelm Reich's work, when he talks about the evolutionary difference or process from what he called the open organome to the closed organome. Like when life energy, consciousness, however we want to start defining that, started to enclose itself, that kind of gave us this whole organismic historical parallel to what we're tracing in the philosophy of thinking.
Right. Yeah. I only know Reich peripherally through Groff, who was influenced by him, so I haven't studied that in enough depth to comment too much on that. But
Jeff, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Your background is in homeopathy, is that correct? Did I hear you say that in the last video? Okay.
Yeah.
I was curious about that connection because I know bioorganics and farming and agriculture and ecology. I mean, Steiner had some incredible successes in those areas. So I was wondering if you had any insights about that connection. Not to put you on the spot, but I'm just aware of that. We all have background knowledge that we could bring forward on occasion and see if we can make more connections here. Thanks.
I mean, I know all the areas of Steiner, but to keep my own sanity in a sense, I always try to root things back to the medicine side, so I know which end is up in the world.
Yeah. I mean, this might get us off topic, but I was interested to discover that the new King Charles, has given lectures over the years on biodynamics and homeopathy, and mentions Steiner obviously in connection with biodynamics, and also is kind of an advocate for, at least used to be, kind of perennialism, which and traditionalist thought, as it's sometimes called. And I think there are important differences between Steiner's more evolutionary mode of engaging with the history of religion and philosophy, but nonetheless, it's interesting to note that the new king has these influences. Curious to see where that might go as his reign begins.
That's really interesting. I had no idea. You can hope.
Yeah.
Didn't the former Queen Elizabeth, before the last one, didn't she have a kind of magician advisor, John Dee, right?
She did.
Yeah.
Elizabeth I.
Yeah, the first. So it must be, runs in the family, maybe.
Well, I mean, it goes hand in hand with royalty going back
Yeah, I wonder if Queen Elizabeth II had an astrologer. I imagine probably that tradition didn't fall away, but who knows?
Might make the monarchy more popular if they were open about that, given how popular astrology is.
Yeah.
I went back to that page that we were talking about earlier, which is the last page of the chapter 3 and that last paragraph, and I I feel like I remember, Matt, when you were reading it initially, you said projected this energy onto an extra human power, but maybe you said into, but that's what I'm seeing now. It says into an extra human world power. And that feels like a bit of a difference in meaning, and I'd be curious to see what the actual German is, but to have the energy, the intrinsic energy of thought projected into an extra human world power, I feel like and that conveys or connotes less of this psychological projection, or more kind of like what you were describing of, I guess, a kind of move towards the periphery, where there's something that's giving strength. And you also noted before we got on the call yesterday or the day before, that it's implicit in this chapter, but what's transpired between the last chapter and this chapter is what Steiner would call the mystery of Golgotha. So that's kind of interesting to keep in mind.
He strangely doesn't mention it much or at all. Did I miss him
No,
mentioning it?
I don't think he does mention it, but you have to kind of maybe wonder, like, if you're reading this and you're familiar with his other works, what the significance might be, that there's it's the religious, I guess, dimension that is really where all the energy is, I guess. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, the most. I mean, there's so much interesting stuff, but in the second chapter, when he was talking about the sort of struggle with evil, um, and the
Yeah.
contrast between a sense of the perfection of the mothers, uh, yeah, Ophionius as this sort of serpent that breaks the world egg and brings evil into the world, and that there's a higher sense of good, which in a kind of dialectical way includes both the perfection and imperfection that are contrasted with each other. And I'm just wondering if the shift to this more religious conception is a heightening of that sense of the fallenness both of the world and of our human faculties, and the need for something to save us that would be superhuman. And I admit here, in reading Steiner's depiction of the early Christian period, I can't help but see some of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, where in this sort of the human consciousness's struggle to sort of stand on its own 2 feet, that there's this period called unhappy consciousness, where the human beings, the human soul finds it necessary to recognize its own existence as a gift from something larger than itself, and so it projects this power outward. So we're kind of in that again. It feels like an incubation period almost that we're reading about in chapter 3.
It's like a psychoanalyst or maybe a structuralist would call it the recognition of the real. Before we had just the imaginary and the symbolic, and the real was like a taboo, like the irrational numbers of the Pythagoreans. And here it's like embracing the real. By real, I don't mean reality. I mean the psychoanalytical or structural concept of real as something that you cannot put into words. Right. And like trauma, and the links to the unhappy consciousness of Hegel. So dealing with this trauma, something that you cannot reconcile, you cannot rationalize. And again, I see it as a a form of the Trinity, because the structure is, the Borromean knot. It's again a form of the Trinity. But again, I think it's the real part, what we are talking, the register of the real, which is coming into the human horizon.
Yeah, and like a heightened sense of the contradiction where the Greeks have this perfected world of thought, and yet here we are living in fleshy bodies that die, and the Roman Empire is just inflicting great harm on these early Christians, and there's a I would think a heightened sense of the contradiction between what the Greeks had achieved in this ideal sense and what earthly existence was still like. And Christ comes into that situation, and the power of that revelation, I think, speaks to how the contradiction might be resolved. Right?
Yeah, because we have been talking about Greek philosophy, but not about the Greek religion. The heathen got this religion, which was originally very strong, but became more and more detached from life. So it's still held on the philosophical level, but there was a great deal of disillusionment with the pagan religions of the time. When Christ came, it really had a niche, a very big niche of market into which come.
Yeah. I just wanted to remind myself, and perhaps the group, you mentioned earlier, Matt, in one of the talks about Bertrand Russell. And I think you maybe mentioned on another talk about Karl Popper and his inability to read Plato. And also Bertrand Russell's failure to, I think that History of Western Philosophy is a terrible book, actually, but it's extremely readable. I read it when I was very young and loved it, but now I look back on it and say, this is awful, because I agree with you. He was that hyper-rationality, and he wasn't able to let go of that and flow with the flow of the thinker and the way that they were thinking, as Steiner so beautifully does. I mean, I ask myself, where is Steiner as he looks at the history of philosophy? Where is he perceiving this from? I say perceiving rather than conceiving, because I believe he was a very perceptually oriented guy. And I think he could allow his, he's very connected to the imaginal realms. He could enter into the weave of the different metaphors and the different kind of structures that were being used by those ancient philosophers. And I'm just, my fantasy is, wow, he does so well with the Gnostics, but he died before the Nag Hammadi library was discovered. We are the beneficiaries of that discovery. But when I listen to him, I get the feeling that he really was able to identify and sort of enter into the weave of these different factions and different strategies and the different kinds of interior processes of these previous thinkers. And that's why I think it's so fascinating to look at him, try to do this philosophically, and working with the epistemology. I think he has a strong epistemological streak in him. But I think I so agree that Russell and Popper and those hyper-rationalists have a very narrow kind of epistemology, which really forbids the insights of someone like Steiner. They just can't enter the weave of Steiner's thinking. So I think it's great that we're trying to make this effort here. Thanks.
Yeah, I read that Russell's History of Western Philosophy early on as I was probably 18, and I was just in such a anxious rush to learn about this history, because I would just beginning to study philosophy, these names get dropped and you can't picture them even on a timeline, much less inhabit the world that they were thinking in. And so Russell was my first go-to, and only later did I realize how biased it is towards a sort of analytic perspective, where he's looking at this whole history for the arguments. It's like, well, what were Plato's arguments, and instead of participating in and perceiving through the eyes of earlier epochs and cultural lives. So, and Popper, I'm not so upset at, because some of his ideas are interesting, but yeah, his reading of Plato, like I don't read the Republic as a straight up manual for how to, design a city state. I don't think that's how Plato intended it.
He's not an urban planner, that's for
No.
sure.
No, it's about the soul and the well-ordered soul. It's not really about how to design a city. I mean, there are parts in the Republic that are kind of hilarious if you were to take them literally. It's like, I think it was written as comedy if you read it correctly. Like some of the ideas about how to manage people's sexual lives, I'm pretty sure Plato was joking. But yeah, we've got a few minutes left. Any other thoughts anyone wants to share? Jeff, I appreciate the volley page. We'll see if we get more participation there or not, but it's nice to know we have that space to share ideas as they occur to us over the week.
So it's chapter 4 next week,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll lead off, okay?
Great. Yeah, thanks, John.
I'll be glad to do that.
The Middle Ages.
Exciting.
Definitely, I look forward to it. I'll have that
You
chapter.
and you post these videos on the on YouTube, is that correct? Okay,
Mhm.
great.
Yep.
Well, I'll throw in just a point to muse on during. It's actually a question for everybody, but maybe we're not coming to definitive answers, I guess. Do you think that metempsychosis and reincarnation are the same thing, or two different circuits?
Metempsychosis.
Metempsychosis.
Which is generally how like the Pythagoreans referred to it. I've always thought of them as synonymous, but I'll give more thought to that, and we can return to that.
Could you repeat that question, Lorenzo?
If you think that reincarnation and metempsychosis are the same thing, I will just elaborate a little so that it's clear, because since we have this four bodies system in Steiner, and we have this quite developed system of let's say reincarnation, but we have a spirit that reincarnates and a soul that reincarnates. It's just the body actually that is that corrupts and is destroyed and reabsorbed. So maybe it's just food for thought. There is your ego reincarnates into a soul that has already been used, let's say, by other spirits. And so there are two levels of things that are being used. The soul, which maybe stays more inside of the family and gives you some kind of flashbacks and memories of former lives, and the movement of the ego, of the more individual side. I'm not saying that this is what Steiner actually theorized, but is something I think about, and I'd like to discuss.
I think metempsychosis, I think, has something to do with reincarnating as an animal or coming out of an animal. And I think reincarnation is much more about human evolution and development. I don't think once you're human, you go back to being a dog or a cat. But who knows? I mean, now that we have a new biology and studying the human biome and all the different creatures that are in our gut, I think that could be, we could reorganize a lot of that thinking. But I remember Pythagoras' metempsychosis. Were that true, I should be changed unto some brutish beast. All beasts are happy, for when they die, their souls are soon dissolved in elements. But mine must live to be plagued in hell. Cursed be the parents that engendered me. I'm a very old hammy actor, I apologize, but I couldn't resist that because that's right out of Faust. You know, and his final speech as he's being dragged off to hell is, I wish I could be turned back into an animal. Anyway, so I recommend Marlowe. That speech is really great.
I'll revisit that this week. All right, you guys, we should wrap it up. Great note to end on. I'll contemplate that this week and look forward to seeing you all next Thursday. I think we're gonna do noon Pacific next week. Does that work? Instead of 2 p.m. Pacific.
Yep.
I'll email everyone with the reminder about that.
Thanks again, Matt.
Thanks
Thank
for
you all.
joining us.
Bye.
Yeah, look forward to next time.
Have a good week.